to order at 7:44 p.m. I will take a motion for the approval of the minutes from January 28th.
So moved.
By Mr. Ticky. Do I have a second? Mr. Kent, all in favor? Please say aye. Aye. Mr. Hardin votes aye. Motion passes unanimous. All right. I'll take a motion for a waiver of the rules of procedure to move item 5, the old business tabled items of sewer appeals, up, so that if there's anybody here, we can get the kind folks who've been patient on their way. Mr. Ticky, do I have a second for that motion? Mr. O'Brien? All right. All in favor of waiving the rules to move item 5 to now the active item, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. So we're going to start with item 5, sewer appeals. So as everyone remembers, our last month meeting, we had 5 appeals come before the commission, and I invite Mr. Marino, Town Attorney Marino, who I have to say drove here 6.7 miles on a flat tire to get here because he's very passionate about what he does, and I thank you for that, sir.
You're quite welcome, and I appreciate you moving up. I thought you were doing that for me also, because I'm sure our roadside assistance is going to be calling any minute. But thank you for taking that out of order, and if you see me exit during the meeting, it's only because I have to give my key to roadside assistance, but I'll be back in. So let me just give you an overview of the process that Mr. Timniak and I used as we went through these meetings with the ratepayers that took appeals. So informal meetings were set up last week. We met on the 11th, I believe the 11th, the 13th, and the 14th with the 5 appellants. And what we, in a very informal way, we sat with the appellants and we discussed the merits of their appeals. And in 2 of the instances, and I'll go through each of them quickly and give you an overview of each, we explained the situation and where matters stood with respect to not only the regulation, but the action of this body, as well as the Connecticut state statutes that would govern as well. And in 2 of the 5 instances, there was a general understanding that their appeals would be either withdrawn or dismissed. I've styled it in a way as being a voluntary dismissal because I did not want anyone who submitted an appeal to feel any pressure at all. And my inclination tonight is to go through each of them with you. You all have a copy of an agreement that I emailed out to the appellants as well, but because of the timing of those meetings and my ability to get these drafts to those individuals, I want to afford them the opportunity to read it more than just today. So my request is going to be that all of these matters be continued to your next meeting, with my expectation that 2 of the 5 are going to go by way of withdrawal, or as I'm styling, as voluntary dismissal. The other 3, they have all been reduced to agreements, and I have every expectation that they're going to remain in general form along the lines of the way these agreements are styled. But again, because we have not had the back and forth with actually when you put it in writing, they say it's never hard to get to the deal, but then when you start talking about the detail of the deal, that's where the deal falls apart. So I don't want to make any misrepresentations or false assumptions here. What you have before you are the agreements based upon my notes from the informal meetings, and all of these have now been sent to the 5 appellants awaiting for their response. And in 2 of the instances, I asked the ratepayers that if they had any objection to me proceeding tonight with a withdrawal or a voluntary dismissal, to let me know, because I had intended, I thought if we can get rid of those 2 because it appeared that they were going to be withdrawn, we could just deal with that and then we would carry the 3 forward. In one instance, Rants and Walk, it's more form, I think, over substance, but he feels, and I agree, that he needs to go to his board and just have a conversation before he says, yes, please dismiss my appeal. So out of an abundance of caution, I think it's best to allow him to go through his process on that end. and then I'll report back to you next month, again, with the expectation it's going to be withdrawn. The other one, so let me do those two first. So Ranson Walk, we met with Joel Lineker on February 11th, and Mr. Lineker, the argument more or less was that he did not believe that this body was following its regulation in how it was adopting its the differences between classes and property owners. And I did point out to him the Connecticut General Statute 7-255 that actually says within the statute that this body has the statutory authority to do just that. So once he saw that, he recognized that his argument was no longer had the merit that he thought, and the problem was that it had not been explained to him in that way. So he, at that point, said, well, I guess we'll agree to withdraw, but he simply wants to explain it to his constituents so, that if anyone has any objection, that they'll come forward and raise that objection by next meeting. Then the other one that fits into that category is 609 Main Street. We had a telephonic conference call on I believe it was the 14th, and the issue on that property is that there are actually two different addresses. There are two buildings, both of which are serviced by one water meter and one discharge pipe, and historically they only received one bill. And so there was confusion, particularly now since they have an unrelated third-party business occupying one of the buildings, and they didn't understand why they were getting two bills. I explained to them, and Mr. Timiak explained to them that our bills are being issued by units, that each building is its own unit, and really when you break down what they were billed, one was charged for the water usage based on the water usage rate, the other one was charged based on your flat per unit rate. So it became very self-evident that you were employing the process that you're employing throughout the entire community. It's just it had not been done historically with this property in that way. So based not only on the amount that was in controversy, but that with an understanding of now what the commission is seeking to do, the ratepayer agreed that there was no merit to the claim and that case should go by way of withdrawal or dismissal. We met with, on February 13th, Mill River Country Club. And the issue with Mill River Country Club is they're a big water user, but a lot of the water is being used for irrigation purposes and for maintenance of their pool during the summer months. And so we explained to them part of the problem that the commission has is that without a discharge meter that can measure the amount of effluent that's being put into the system, the only legitimate basis that the commission has for purposes of establishing its bill for sewer usage is to use the water meter. And that if they were willing to put on a meter so that we can begin measuring the amount of effluent that's actually being discharged, we can take into account a reduction for the current bill, and then going forward, base all future bills on that meter. And part of the issue with this concept for a lot of the ratepayers that we talked with is it's an unknown expense. Well, how much is it going to cost? Is it as simple as, is it a couple of $1,000s or is it a couple of tens of thousands of dollars? They just, didn't have the information that they felt they needed, but they thought in concept, particularly with Mill River, that yes, they would put the meter on. And so what we had, if you look at this agreement, and in any of the agreements, the operative paragraphs are after the language of the now therefore, and it's normally the first, second, or third paragraphs where the operative language of each agreement is set in. So what we have agreed in principle, subject to your approval, is that by April 30th, they are going to install at their sole expense, a flow meter for the discharge pipe. And then what that will do is that will then set going forward for the next period and into the future the ability of your staff to actually determine with more exactitude what's coming into your system. But we have the current bill that we have to take into consideration. The current bill is it's 4158 times 2. If you're that your calculator will do that in your head, it's for rough numbers about $9,300. What we said is what we would do is they would pay 50% of that, and again, taking into account that they have established budgets based upon what they've historically paid, and what they currently received was a bill that was dramatically higher than what they had been used to paying. And so what we said is, well, pay 50% of the historical bill and then put the flow meter in. And then because they cannot tell us with any reasonable degree of certainty what percentage is going into irrigation or the pool, and we need some reasonable basis to form a belief if we're going to compromise in that way. So, but what we can do is take the data that we begin getting from the flow meters, and April will begin the irrigation season for them as they're getting ready to open up and for their season, and then we'll be able to extrapolate imperfectly, however it may be, but it will only be for this 1 year, to get them to pay something either based on historical or actual based upon the data that we get going forward. So we thought a fair way of proceeding is getting them to pay 50% of what their historical bill is, not forgiving the balance, but holding the balance just on hold for a moment while the flow meter is put in, and then we gather that data. And then we will circle back to them, and we will be able to fix the second half of last year's bill. And then again, all future bills will be based off of the flow meter going forward. Nuevo Pasta was in a similar situation. They agreed that flow meter would be an ideal solution to their problem, but they did not know, and so therefore they could not commit that they would agree to put in a flow meter because they just didn't know how much it was going to cost. So we said, well, look, without that commitment of putting it in, it's hard for us to, with any good faith, come to the WPCA and make a recommendation. So we have to come to some type of an agreement that we can recommend. So actually, to their credit, what they had suggested is, well, let's just the current bill. So we will agree that we'll work with you for a compromise for the current bill, and we will agree we're going to explore the installation of a flow meter. But if we cannot come to an agreement on the installation of a flow meter by a date certain, then we will be subject to the historical way you billed us going back. So any reduction you're going to give us is not going to be applicable going forward. And that's our leverage, because I was hesitant to enter into any agreement with them. I said, because then once we reduce agree to reduce by a certain percentage, what incentive do they have to put on a flow meter, right? So we have to, in order to have that leverage, then if after this one bill is paid, they do not come to terms with the commission with the installation of a flow meter, then they're going to have to go through this process again in the future. They will not have the benefit of an ongoing reduction. So what they did is they presented us with data that established that about 62% is about the average percentage of water that is actually used as part of their recipe, not only with the making of the pasta, but of the manufacturing, the producing of the pasta. And it's a range, but 62% presented as the median number. Could be as depending upon when it was. It could be as high as 80, and it could be lower. But 62% was a good number that we felt comfortable with recommending. And they were billed a sum of $39,493.84. And what we are saying for this purposes and this purpose only of that bill is that their bill would be reduced by 62%, which is the amount that they were able to establish as about the average median number of manufacturing water that's used for their product. And that within 30 days of the date that this agreement would be adopted, they would pay, therefore, the sum of $14,027.24, and that any agreement is going to be limited to the invoices subject to this appeal, and if they fail to install a flow meter by June 30th of 2019. So we want to give them a reasonable period of time to investigate and try to determine that this is, in fact, in their best interest. But if they have not gotten a meter installed by that date, which we thought was reasonable, it's the end of this fiscal year, that then any benefits that they received under this agreement would not be prospective, and we would go back to simply the historical way of billing. And again, the only reason why I'm recommending that we do that is because if without that, then you have no leverage to get a flow meter if that's the desire of the commission. The last appeal was Barnum Wash and Dry LLC. That one was a telephonic conference with Patrick Laurent. That was also done on February 14th. And with that one, there was a general conversation. Obviously, it's a laundromat. We expect that the water usage is quite high there. There was a belief on the part of the ratepayer that it was about 15% of the water is used for purposes of cleaning, meaning if it's dry cleaning, like steam is lost. So when Mr. Timiak and I were talking, we said, well, he didn't come and say 50%, which would sound somewhat suspect. 15% if he's doing that type of drying that is a drying with steam, which is possible in the dryers, that it's not unreasonable. So what we did say, though, and I spoke to Mr. Laurent, is that I was uncomfortable proceeding only with the tenant, because if to the extent that he agreed to something, it was going to be something that was going to bind his landlord, because it's truly the landlord that has the ultimate obligation to pay this. If the tenant goes out of business and or runs in the middle of the night, we're simply going to turn to the owner. So after discussion with Mr. Timniak, we reached out to the owner of the property, which is Tough Stuff Properties LLC, and the member there, Ray Martin. We had a conversation with him. We also talked a little bit about the tenant, and he thought that the proposal that we were recommending was reasonable under the circumstances, and said that he was going to try to work with his tenant to try to get all of these things, because there are some issues not only with the sewer authority, and there are other collections that the city is efforting to do, but the landlord's going to work with the tenant to try to put him on the right track. So he was comfortable with the agreement. He was forwarded a copy of this agreement as well, and the recommendation on this one would be a reduction of 15% of the outstanding bill, and that any invoices generated prior to the April 30th or 2019 date are going to be calculated using the water usage, but we're then going to reduce that amount by 15%. And then beginning May 1st, 2019 going forward, fees shall be calculated using the information obtained from the flow meter, should it be installed. And if the ratepayer fails to install the water meter, any benefits afforded will terminate, and we'll go back to the historical way like we did in the other one. Again, the goal here ultimately is to get these ratepayers who have water usage that doesn't really fit into the traditional just go with the water bill model, and put them into a system where we can actually get actuals rather than generals. And I did tell, to the extent any of the ratepayers are here, I tried to tell them all that I told them they were welcome to attend. I didn't feel that there was going to be any action taken by the body tonight, because it was my recommendation that we continue these to your next meeting to afford them the opportunity to review it with council if that was their decision, so that when we come forward with an actual recommendation, it is hopefully something that both we and the ratepayers are doing together. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Marino? Mr. Can?
Thank you, Mr. Marino. The explanations all made perfect sense, and waiting another 30 days makes sense. Ransom's Walk was the one that wasn't clear to me. What would he go back, what do we foresee him telling his, the people that lease from him?
So again, that's the problem with that commercial condominium is that they have 11 units. There was, when we were trying to determine why they were built the way they were, and we're going back historically to when these relationships came into being, you know, we had more anecdotal. There was, you know, were they being charged as one unit, because it's one water meter servicing 11 with one discharge pipe, and so what we explained to them is that the authority charges on a per unit basis, and that they have the right to do that. And he was looking at the entire collective as one unit because it's 1 meter, 1 discharge. And, you know, how is it fair if we only have 1 meter and 1 discharge, that you're charging us kind of that base per unit? You know, we're small business owners and we can't afford this. And I said, well, but if everyone's being treated fairly, meaning equally, and you didn't protest when you had the opportunity to come out at the public hearing and raise your opinion and to persuade the commission otherwise, then that is what the rule is. And it was done at a public hearing, duly noticed, and it was approved by the commission. He said, but where does it say so in the regulations? And I said, well, I appreciate what you're saying, sir, but you don't understand that this commission derives its authority out of the statute, and you're focused solely on the regulations. So why don't we start with the genesis of their authority and flow from there? And then when I brought him to 7255 and the words were specific, he was basically saying, how is it fair that you're treating different classes of properties differently? You should treat us all the same. We're all using water and we're all discharging into the system. What's the difference? And I said, because the statute specifically says that this body has the ability to create different classifications and to charge people differently. As soon as he saw that, he said, you know, thank you very much. I don't think my argument has any merit anymore. So I said, then I'll style this as a withdrawal, which we call a voluntary dismissal. So it came down to as simple as that. He was frustrated. He felt there was he wasn't able to get a direct answer through communication, I think he was directed to the tax assessor's office, and he was confused. And I don't want to I wasn't there, so I don't know. And I spoke with the tax assessor once on the phone, and she was a pleasure. So, you know, I don't want to speak to that interaction, but that's what he said to me. Once I explained it to him in simple terms, and I put the statute in front of him and read it with him, he seemed to understand it and get it, and he just walked away.
Are there similar commercial buildings that have multiple businesses, separate units, so to speak?
Well, for example,
with one input and one discharge.
For example, 609, which is actually, I think, 609, 611 Main Street, has multiple buildings, which, as is explained to me, it has 1 water meter and 1 discharge. So that's another example before you. And I'm sure there's plenty of examples throughout your town, but I'm unaware of any others.
Okay.
And going back, and Mr. Marino, correct me if I'm wrong, the genesis of this was doing the audit of this, essentially an audit of our connections and trying to, over time, pick up things like this. So there could be more.
Yeah, I wasn't sure of how deep you wanted to get into the weeds here. I didn't want to say anything beyond what my,
right.
You know, but yeah, basically, the fundamental purpose is to make sure going forward, because what happened in the past, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's in the past. We want to go forward, make sure that everyone is treated fairly and equally, and everyone is charged the way this body says they should be.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of what is being done, and unfortunately, we're not going to catch 100% of the people. So some people are going to not pay as much as they should, and some people may pay a little bit more. Ultimately, if people are watching, it's their obligation to come forward if they feel there's an issue with their bill. But the staff is continuing to look and try to catch as many of these issues as exist, but, you know, it's as perfect as they discover.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Marino? No? Okay. So then, if you don't mind, I'll entertain a motion to, you're asking us, just so we're clear, we're going to hold, and I'll repeat these so we're on the record and clear. For Ransom Walk, we're going to wait to hold off until notification. For the second, for Breezy Point, we're moving forward with withdrawal / dismissal, pending verification from the appellant. Or are we waiting on anybody, or are you recommending we motion to move on certain ones tonight?
Well, no, so for purposes of I just want to make sure that everyone's due process is protected and that there's no ambiguity anywhere. So my recommendation tonight is that all 5 be adjourned to your next meeting, which is March 25th.
Fine.
But with the expectation that Ransom Walk is going to be a voluntary dismissal, 609 Main Street is going to be a voluntary dismissal, and we're going to have stipulations on agreement with respect to the other 3 as are articulated in the documents before you.
Okay, so I will entertain that motion.
So moved.
Okay, Mr. Dickey, and do I have a second? Mr. Can. All right, so all in favor of pushing to the March meeting per Mr. Marino's request? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
you. I
Marino.
appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. Okay, we're going to go back up to item number 3, report of town engineer. How you doing, Mr. Casey?
So just an update on the current projects. The I&I SSES project study is being, nearing completion as they finish their manhole inspection work and conduct some building inspections. So far, they've been able to do about 40% of what they hope to do for the building inspections, which is, they have been getting cooperation, so that's nice, but they haven't found any significant inflow sources. So there's 60% left to go, so maybe we'll find something as we go. That'll be pretty much the end of the study when we complete the fieldwork portion, and then the bulk of the data will be sorted through and analyzed, and recommendations will be made. We are recommending that in June that Time Bond would come and give us a report summary on that. The pump station project, Amy is here from Time Bond. She can give a report. But one of the things that we have discussed recently, which we're going to need some guidance on, is the aesthetics of the buildings as they are reconstructed to meet the flood regulations, and we rebuild walls and roofs and elevate systems. The question came up about what we want the buildings to look like in the neighborhoods that they're in. So Amy has some ideas, and we handed out the handout that Amy will refer to show some of the options. And then I'll just remind you that when we get ready to bid this project in the summer, that we will have to have a bond ordinance in place before we go to bid. So in April or May, the town council should start that process. So Amy, if you want to.
Thank you.
Report.
Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. I missed you last month, but I was talking about you guys to all my engineering colleagues. So the pump stations, 5 out of the 6 pump stations are coming to a close on the design. Ryan's Lane, we are not working on right now because the developer may come in or something's going to happen, so we don't want to push that design too much further and then have to redo it in the future. So 5 of the 6 is going to be one package that John just stated. We're going to bid hopefully this summer, which means we'll have some shovels in the ground. So structural impacts. We've gone through all of our calculations and built the models of your 5 stations. You would think similar construction, all 1970s, we'd have one solution, and we have multiple solutions for each of the stations. So you're getting unique approaches to each of them. For Riders Lane, we're gonna have micro piles to dig into the ground and keep that pump station tied to the ground as water comes up to it. We're gonna have pilasters, which are like concrete pilasters to strengthen the interior wall between your dry pit and your wet pit. We're gonna do some FRP reinforcement on your intermediate walls to make sure that you don't have any cracking in the underground walls. And then at Ryder's Lane, we do not have to do any work to the above grade other than switch some windows around, switch out the doors to flood-proof doors, some hatches, and then get those louvers above the 100-year plus 3 feet elevation. So good news, we don't have to take down the walls, which is something we were hoping to avoid, but we've been able to prove it. For Benton Street, we're going to do a similar approach for the interior of the walls. Pilasters, FRP reinforcement. Here we do not need to tie down the station with the micropiles outside of the perimeter of the station, but we do have to rebuild the unreinforced above grade walls, which are CMU block and brick veneer. So we have a couple of choices that we could go through. Peck's Mill Pond is similar to Benton, as is Oak Bluff. Short Beach actually has a concrete wall that has reinforcement in it with a stucco finish. So we do not need to rebuild the above grade walls at Short Beach because it's strong enough on its own. So you have a big decision to make there. So roof options. We're proposing to install precast concrete flat roofs at all at 4 of the 5 stations. Ryder's Lane does not need it. So when you have a flat roof, there's 3 different options that you could go for, and I've actually pulled some pictures. The first is a mansard roof. So if you're looking at roof option A in your handout, it actually has an area of shingles that protrudes from the corner of the roof out. It's a typical design of the 70s. It keeps the aesthetic similar to what your neighbors are used to seeing. And if wanted, you could replace this. Styles do come back around, so we're probably due for it to be popular again at some point. The next option is a gravel stop. So this is a newer design. It has a metallic edge and actually has about 1 foot of gravel on top of the roof to help it drain properly. It's a lower cost option, and it's very typical of what architects recommend for these types of stations. And then if you guys like to get a little fancier, we also have a coin option. So this is a precast larger brick that's either wet cast or dry cast. It has the same impact structurally as a brick veneer, and it gives an impression of permanence, strength, and also a sense of presence. So that precast would be in a different color that's offset from the brick veneer, goes across the roof, down the walls in a pattern, and then we could put it above the doors as well. So John says this does not need to go through an architectural review. You have a new committee in town. Pump stations are all yours, so I'm hoping we could come to a conclusion today as to what options you'd like to do so that we can finish up this design for you. And
Do you
this is
have,
the first of 2 decisions for tonight.
thank you, Amy. Do you have cost estimates on each of these?
So the gravel stop will be the least expensive. The mansard roof and the coins are pretty similar. All of these will fit into the budget that we previously gave you, since we don't have to do micropiles at all 5 of the stations. We don't have to do FRP reinforcement across all of the stations, so we've been able to move things around. But gravel is the least expensive. Coins and mansard are comparable.
Each building may have a different individual cost, but is it like 10% more, 50% more for the gravel?
I don't want to mislead you, and I don't have that cost right off the top of my head.
And each of the buildings, you mentioned the mansard, if you will, because it looks like shingles you'd see on a residence. How many of these pump stations are in a residential area versus a commercial area or a not visible from the road area?
Ryan's Lane is the only pump station that's not in a residential area. Benton Street has industry on one side of the road, but it backs up against a residential street, so they're all visible. Ryan's is at on Main Street, so it's set back.
Right, correct me if I'm wrong, it's down past Ryder's Landing, down in that corner.
Ryder's Lane is up at Ryder's Lane.
You're right.
Up near Sikorsky.
I'm sorry. I'm tired.
You're going past the commercial area, but
Yeah.
you're heading toward the condos,
Towards Hornock.
The other ones, Peck's Mill, Bluff, Short Beach, are residential.
Can we maybe get what I'd like to know before I just say which one goes where is get an understanding of a quick summary of what each one looks like currently today, right? So number one, aesthetics, so we can keep people happy with what they're looking at, especially if it's in residential. And then two, the actual cost of each one. I'd feel more comfortable seeing that first and then moving forward with it. Does gravel, would gravel cost us $10,000 versus $15,000 for Mansard? That's what I'd like to see. Any other questions?
I just got one. Mr. Chair?
Mr. Ticky?
Life expectancy, all the same for the three?
Basically
Within.
the same. Because your structure isn't changing, you're still going to have a precast flat roof to weigh it down and also provide the structure. It's just aesthetics.
And Amy, are we going to be, based off your initial assessment that you were talking about, are we going to be, again, everything, is who knows until you get in there, but it sounded like Ryder's Lane might come in under budget because there's a lot less that we might have to do. Is that a fair assessment right now?
Well, this is all going to be bid as one package
Right.
now, so we won't have each pump station's cost separated out.
Okay.
But I think on the whole, since we've been able to build this model and have different impacts to it, including the tidal waves hitting it from the side, we'll be under the $20 million.
Okay.
So the Short Beach station, all these other stations were going to be rebuilding the walls.
Right.
But Short Beach were not. So that's one we could talk about because you do have a picture. And because we're not building the walls, the question is, should we just leave it as is, or should we make it look like the other stations? Of course, this one is out in front of the
Condos.
restaurant there,
Yep.
condos across the street. It's the entrance to the park. So this one's, as opposed to the other four, this one it will require work that we wouldn't have to do otherwise if we wanted to make it look nicer.
Change it up.
So this is decision number 2 of 2 for the
No, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun.
So for decision one, in terms of the roofs,
I'll
can
get you more information.
can we hold that off till, okay, I'll say if you can provide us that over the next couple weeks, and then, or the next few weeks, that analysis.
So the quicker I get it to you and the quicker you make a decision, the quicker we could go to bidding.
That's
So
fine. I mean,
if you want to wait a month, we can. It's just going to hold us up a little bit for the design, which we can do.
yeah, I'd like to, I know for me personally, I'd like to see all side by side in the numbers, A, B, and C costs, and I'm sure everyone else here will probably be the same way unless anyone wants to comment on that. Mr. Ken?
Is anyone going to, you can see the mansard like at Short Beach. That's visible as you look at the building. But no one's going to be seeing the roofs of the building per se.
No.
Aren't the roofs all going to be gravel? They're just going to have a different facade?
So the roofs will all be flat precast roofs. If you see them, it depends on at what area you're at. So at Peck's Mill, it's next to the pond, and then the resident adjacent to it is actually up on a hill. So they might be able to see something, but they've got a tree line there. There's a existing pump station there with a gabled roof and a chimney, and it's got odor control.
Facade versus not a facade. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's aesthetics.
Well, the other thing that we should point out is there will be equipment on top of the parking lot.
So another reason other than weighing down the stations with the weight of the concrete for a precast roof is so that we could get the louvers into the roof. So that will give you more wall space, so we don't have to build the walls as high. So louvers are openings in a wall to let air in and out. When you have generators or ventilation systems, you need them. Because we have to build to 100+ 3-foot storm, those have to be out of that elevation. And because some of your stations have the 100-year plus 3-foot storm elevation at 2 feet below your ceiling line, that's a way that we could install the louvers into the pump station without having a 20-foot high wall, 30-foot high wall.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Gann.
Do we need the committee to meet formally and have a vote on this, or is it something we can do informally in a week or two once we get some deltas on what the costs are?
You know what we'll do? We'll ask Mr. Marino when he comes back, because I think he just went out to have he left his bag here, so I have no problem asking that question. And we'll go back. So let's go on to item number 2.
So
Thank you, Amy.
Short Beach has concrete walls, it's reinforced, and it has a stucco finish. It's a yellow and brown color. It's adjacent to the golf course. There's a restaurant behind it, and in front of it is a set of condos, kind of near the airport. So the question is, do we want to replace the above-ground walls that aren't required structurally? We won't be making some changes because the louvers have to be raised a bit. The windows have to be blocked over to make sure water can't go in, but physical walls can stay in place with minor modifications. So, do you want to bring it to this century?
So aesthetically, you're saying can we paint the walls?
You can paint the walls.
So we don't have to rebuild the walls and save some money?
You can. It's a stucco finish right now. We could even, I think there's a way to put a thinner brick veneer on the outside so it's not required for the energy code like the other stations require a brick veneer with an air gap between the CMU. But we could pretend to have bricks on the outside if that's the image you want to go for.
So, Mr. Gann.
If in the picture, you can see the restaurant?
Yep.
Building behind it. So if we changed, if you have to change the Maynard roof because you're doing louvers and windows, is that the existing Maynard roof has to be removed?
So that roof doesn't have to be removed. We can just work within the existing walls right now. We're going to be blocking over some windows.
And it's not deteriorated, it could just be left alone?
Shingles.
Then if we're going to do new shingles, just doing this similar color to what's on the restaurant?
We could
That
match
would
it.
be,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
that'd be it?
Yeah. Can we essentially almost try to replicate the design and the color tones of the restaurant in the back?
Define design.
Well,
Just the color.
the color, the shingles, to on the gazebo portion, and that would be nice. Put a lighthouse on top.
We can.
I have no problem. Structurally, as long as the walls, and you guys feel the walls are in good shape, let's not mess around with it, but let's try to color tone it to the restaurant building.
So keeping.
So keep the roof, keep the look overall, maybe reface the walls. We'll look at some option of refacing the walls or restuccoing them or putting something on them to make it upgrade and tie together with the rear building.
Reface with stucco or reface with a brick veneer facade?
Well, so,
Paint the stucco.
Yeah.
well, if you're going to have bricks, so that that's not in keeping with the building behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so next,
Colors.
Try to get
So
the
stucco
same
with
color
a
tone.
similar color, or like we talked about, the collaborative possibility.
Okay.
But not replacing the walls, just refacing them, I think.
Yeah.
We can give you the architect can weigh in on that.
Yeah, we'll give a couple options during construction. based on what materials would work.
And through the chair?
Yep.
One other, more equipment on the roof now, or in the future than there is now? Is that, meaning would the Maynard roof hide new equipment that's not already there? Or is it just an aesthetic feature that's?
It's an aesthetic feature. So this is still a flat roof, and the mansard shingles actually come down from the corner.
Below the roof line?
Yeah. So
Right,
it's
so they're below the roof line?
yeah. So you're not hiding anything like a doghouse manhole or
All right.
a doghouse.
Yeah, gravel stop. Thank you.
If we can, Mr. Casey, just make a note again to try to make sure that those shingles match the roof shingles of the, thank you. I'm okay with that. Thank you, Amy. All right, so let's do this, because I'm okay, I'm inclined to go with Mr. Can's suggestion in terms of if you can email us over the next week and we could possibly informally send you back our recommendations, I'm okay with that, but I just want to make sure Mr. Marino's okay, and I know he hasn't left yet, so when he comes back in, I'll pull him up real quick and
I'm here all night.
you go for that. All right, cool. Thank you. Actually, Mr. Marino, one more question for you, if you don't mind. Put you on the spot. We're just having a quick conversation about some aesthetics for some of the pump stations in town through Ty and Bond, and the question came up in terms of deciding on the roof design for five of the pump stations. Can Amy put together basically some ABC options with costs, email them to the commission, and we can informally send back our responses, or does it have to be in a formal vote?
Well, really, the concern, if to the extent you're raising a concern, would really be whether or not that type of action would violate the Freedom of Information Act, right? Because anytime you're conducting the people's business, it's supposed to be done in open session at a duly noticed meeting.
Yep.
And we caution commissions from engaging in electronic communication because technically to the extent that qualifies as conducting business, it would be in violation of the Freedom of Information Act. So what I tend to do is for her to send it to you for purposes of speed, that's fine, but I don't believe it would be appropriate for you to take action by way of drawing a consensus of, I like this one, I like that one, or I'm on board. What you can do is it would be appropriate, even though it sounds a little silly, is if you wanted to schedule a special meeting, and this is how crazy this is, but you can do it, schedule a special meeting as long as someone is here and there's an opportunity for the public to come and watch. You all could you could all be on your telephone and you can voice in over the phone. Again, the key is that we have to be as transparent and do it in a duly noticed public session. So if you want to receive your information that way, you can do it, but you shouldn't take any action in response. But if you want to get it done before the next meeting, we can accommodate a schedule that doesn't require everyone from coming out.
Okay.
Okay?
Would it be possible, can we put it on the next town council's agenda, or it has to be, it's a completely separate commission, so we could call a special meeting very briefly, maybe before the next council meeting, obviously, if we wanted
correct.
to. Okay.
Yeah, you could have it could be a 5-minute meeting. I mean, if it's one action item and you kind of are all in lockstep of what you're going to do, you just do it right before your town council meeting.
Yeah, we'll try to do that.
Okay.
So, thank you, Ben.
right.
So, Amy, if you don't mind, we'll get on this. You can get us the information, the compare and contrast of the A, B, and C options, costs, what they kind of look like now, and what you're, I guess, recommending, and then we'll talk and we'll try to get something done quickly.
When's the next town council meeting?
It's going to be March 11th, second Monday. So I'll speak with you. We'll coordinate.
No problem.
Thank you. Mr. Casey, do you have, you still have a few? Yeah.
And then last month, I reported that our lining project is complete, and we're under budget on that, and we talked about, our next phase. So the first phase there, if you recall, we added work to the original contract. Were coming so under budget, we decided to increase the amount of work we were doing, so we added twice as much work to the project. And during that course of that, because a lot of the work was on state roads, we did hit some unknown conditions there, and because they were on state roads, there were some different requirements. We had to do some traffic management plans on Boston Avenue and Lordship Boulevard and Stratford Avenue. So the engineering effort came in over what we had originally estimated. So we were looking to increase the engineer's contract there. I wrote $32,000, but I re-looked at it, and it's $24,048. So we'd like to compensate the engineer for that work, and then that'll close out the project for the first phase.
So, John, are you asking for?
This would be an amendment to the engineer's contract for engineering work we had to do during construction, because we didn't bid out that other piece. We added it to the contract. We just kept going with the contract. So there was some engineering required primarily because they were on state roads.
Okay. So you need a motion to amend that?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Perillo? Mr. Gann? Any discussion on that? Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No opposed. No problem, John.
And then with the balance of the authorized funding that's left over from that project, and with our new proposed funding for sewer rehab projects, I've outlined some thoughts of where we would be doing rehab work next for another project, for a new project. So the first bullet point there is the West Trunk sewer in the area of Greenfield Avenue. That has been a problem area for a while. We targeted it during Ty and Bond's I&I study. We did find that there is some surcharge going on in that area, which we kind of knew we were going to find that as we embarked on the project. So we would like to do a lining project in that area, but in the meantime, or prior to making that decision, Ty and Bond is running the models to see if the sewer sizing is appropriate for lining or if any of it needs to be upgraded. So we would want to do a lining project there, except for the areas where we may have to do some upgrades. Stratford Center, when we do the Complete Streets project, we'd like to do those sewer primarily from Barnum Avenue down to East Broadway. That's all original tile pipe sewer from the 1920s. The piece on sewer on Linden Avenue that we would be working in and around and over when we do the West Broad Street Improvement Project. We'd like to line that. It's only one or two sections there. The Northwest Trunk, which is the trunk sewer that feeds the Broadbridge Avenue pump station. We've found some evidence that there might be some soil getting into the pipe there, some gravel we were finding in the lines. So, that might be a candidate for doing some lining. It's all in easement. It's all in the woods, a lot of it. So I'm sure we have some root intrusions. So if we went through and cleaned it out and put a liner up that pipe, that would be extend that life, for another 100 years. And then Lines Place, we found a problem there. We have to do some replacement there, and then we would line that. It's only one segment of pipe. We wouldn't do the whole street, just that one segment that leads toward Stratford Avenue, which we're going to be doing the Stratford Avenue roundabout work there. So we're trying to dovetail a lot of the work that we're doing in conjunction with other projects, which we did in the last project, and then where we have some significant areas where we need to do improvements. So that's why we've identified those locations.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Casey. Yes, Greg.
Thank you, Chair. John, the last line in 1998 at Marcroft, what's the average, do you have an average lifespan for sewer lining?
The lining, well, it's a relatively new technology, so we don't have a test of it, but it is a resin plastic material, and it'll last, over 50 years, 75 years, 100 years.
Thank you. Okay. Moving on. Mr. Hyde, how are you?
Good evening. Monthly operating report for January 2019. Flows averaged 12.73 million gallons for January 19. It's 86% higher than January 18 at 6.86. We've got a lot of water coming down these days. Average water temperature, January was 53.5, down another 3.6 degrees. Nitrogen release during January averaged 249 pounds per day, which is well below the 356 limit. We are holding our own. We are running well. This is the hardest, most stressful time of year to run the plant from now through April. And it's a 24/7 job, and we're taking calls all night, and it's under control, fortunately. Plant pump station maintenance. We had repairs for both pumps from Oak Bluff Pump Station quoted. One was quoted at $10,750, the other at $89.95. This is a station we talked about a couple months ago. Back in October, we lost some pumps. We had taken a pump from a spare pump from Riders and used it. We're deciding which of the other two pumps we should repair. I would like to get a fund approval for the $8,995 to do the repair on that pump.
And you're also looking for access road pump as well
Yes.
at $75.50?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the $8,995 repair for Oak Bluff and $75.50 for access road. Mr. Hardin, seconded by Mr. Perillo. Any discussion on that? Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Go ahead, Mr. Hyde.
Thank you. Effluent pump number 1, we've got a water seal failure. We're scheduling a technician and associate electromechanics to service the seal and evaluate the pump bushing replacement. There's a bushing beneath that seal that we have lost, and we want to, they're going to come in and take a good close look at it to find out what we can do to replace that. So we don't have the full answer on the cost on that at this time. Ultraviolet disinfection. Suez is scheduling a technician to troubleshoot the panel and diagnose the fluctuations in measurements in approximately 2 weeks. We hope to have them in here. Safety improvements. The Headworks, the plant influent pump station, requires installation of platforms to allow access for maintaining and replacement of pump drive shafts and drive shaft bearings. This work has been quoted by Snyder Engineering, our qualified engineer, at $93,275. I would like to get approval for these funds also and move forward with this project. This is an area where we're working over the 3-foot pipes between the pumps, walking step ladders. It's an area where you've asked me many times, are we going to get to this stuff? And I would like to get to it today.
Okay. Mr. Hardin. Motion made by Mr. Hardin, seconded by Mr. Perillo. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Chair votes aye.
The sludge thickener tanks require a ladder to allow access for monitoring, maintaining, and repair. This ladder, with installation, has been quoted at $20,770. I'd like authorization to move forward with this. These last 2 repairs will also be scheduled for into July, so they will be the 2020 budget.
Okay. Mr. Hardin, I'd like to make the motion. Do I have a second? Mr. Perillo. Oh, sorry, Greg. Mr. Perillo seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Chair votes aye. Thank you, Mr. Hyde.
Thank you.
Any questions? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion for adjournment. Mr. Perillo, do I have a second? Mr. Harden, all in favor? Aye. Thank you. 8:43.